give it up for Mary Grove.
Thank you. That was amazing.
Yeah, it can be a little bit unnerving, but anyway, welcome. And I have to say right off the bat that I'm a little bit starstruck having Mary here.
You're way too nice, Tom.
Yeah, I actually, the first time I saw you was at our global event a few years back, and you actually interviewed MC Hammer, which was extraordinary. So if anybody's interested in seeing the video of that, it's on our website. But anyway, so tonight is all about you. And so why don't we start out with telling us about, you know, where you grew up, what kinds of things were you thinking and doing as a kid, and we'll just go from there.
Great. Well, thank you again for having me, and thanks for coming out. This is so wonderful to meet more of the great community here in Chicago. And so my story actually begins here in Chicago. This is a city that plays a special role in my family's history. So my parents both immigrated from Thailand, and they met here in Chicago. They got married here. My older sister, who's here tonight, was born here. And so, you know, definitely the American dream, the sort of story of the quintessential American dream of coming here in search of opportunity, in search of a better future for your family. That was sort of part one of the chapter. I was born next door in Davenport, Iowa, and I grew up in San Diego, so kind of made my way west, if you will, with my family. But my parents were both entrepreneurs, and they definitely bootstrapped things. They together ran a small business for over 30 years. And having that unique lens as our upbringing was just a tremendous part of driving, you know, who I have become and the lens through which I see my work today. All of the hustle, the grit, but the beautiful opportunities that you can create and the future that you can imagine and actually make a reality. So I grew up in San Diego, and I ended up studying at Stanford in Silicon Valley. And at the time, I didn't actually think I would work in tech. That was sort of a natural connection that I hadn't made. But I was always very passionate about international development and women's issues. I was fortunate when I was 22 to go back to Thailand and do a fellowship at the United Nations in Bangkok, focused on sex trafficking. And so later, you know, a few years later, the missing link for me was that technology actually was such this amazing vehicle that could enable progress so quickly. And I joined Google, which then was just somewhat of a well-known startup 12 years ago.
Wow.
And the rest is history.
So tell us a little bit about that. So when you joined Google, you started out in their legal team, right? And this was 2004-ish, I want to say.
Exactly.
So tell us about sort of the environment, I guess, at Google in 2004, what you were working on and kind of your journey getting started there.
I feel tremendously privileged. The last 12 years have been a great experience, a great journey of growth on so many levels. So I joined the company in 2004, and we were about 2,000 people. Google is currently over 60,000 people around the world now, just in a 12-year period. So when I joined, it was a very tight-knit, organic, bottoms-up, flat, open culture. I joined the legal team, as you mentioned, actually working on the IPO. And so even in the process, in the way in which Google did their public offering was so dramatically different. We did the Dutch auction model, wanting to democratize access so that, you know, those who weren't as independently wealthy could also bid and have a piece of Google from the beginning. So I spent a year working on the IPO and helped us go public, and we had to figure out how to actually operate as a public company. But then I really just fell in love with the company. I thought I would stop and spend a year there en route to law school, and that didn't happen. So how long, did you spend? Well, first of all, I'm curious about the model and the IPO and such. And I hate to use this overused term, but what did that disrupt, and how did you go about that? It was a really interesting time. It was a really small company focused on search and focused on a few core areas. One thing that I've always loved about Google was it started as a search engine, right? Our two founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, started the company as graduate students at Stanford, and they ended up stopping out and going full-time with Google. But from the early days, it was sort of not focused on revenue, not focused on monetization. There was no business model whatsoever for quite a long time. So when we went public, it was somewhat surprising because people didn't actually understand how much Google was monetizing and how successful this model could be. So the IPO was similar. It was, the founders wrote a letter. I encourage you, if you're interested in sort of what makes Google tick, go back and read the founders letter, which is a letter that Larry and Sergey wrote to the shareholders when they went public. Talked a lot about our internal models of don't be evil. It starts with, Google is not a conventional company and we do not intend to become one. And they've been so deeply committed throughout the evolution. We've gone through numerous transitions and really just sticking true to those core values.
That's awesome. So let's fast forward a little bit, but I want to chat about kind of how did you go from legal team to the creation, or I guess just walk us through how Google for Entrepreneurs was created and how you came about being a part of it.
Sure. So the missing years in between there, what happened after the legal team for me? So I had the opportunity I by then had fallen in love with the mission of the company, with the culture, spent a lot of time with the founders and the team, and just really believed in their mission, which was so audacious, right? To organize all the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And there's so much, to me, that's limitless, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I ended up moving over to work for a woman named Megan Smith, who is now the CTO of the United States. And she's a phenomenal leader with so much vision. She was running a small team at the time called New Business Development. And so we were focused on everything sort of non-product and engineering, early stage partnerships, tech licensing, distribution, what to do when you launch a Google product, how to get it into hands of users through partnerships. So I was lucky to spend about 6 years working with that team, lived in New York for 4 years, moved to Zurich, which is our headquarters for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And in that time, I was covering emerging markets. So looking at new markets for Google, what are the opportunities, and had an extraordinary opportunity to spend time in the very emerging markets, so places including Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine. And in each of these markets, we would look at three things. Number one, how do we increase access? So how do we partner with mobile operators, with internet service providers to help more people have access to the web? Number two was how do we increase content creation from these regions? The web is only so great as the content that exists. And so, for example, at the time, 5% of the world's population spoke Arabic, and yet only 1% of content on the web was Arabic. So partnering with news organizations, bloggers, getting user-generated content was bucket two. And then bucket three, which became my own personal favorite, was entrepreneurship. And it was how do we work with students and developers and startups and sort of the nascent ecosystems in these communities to really help them create their future, their own economic development driven locally. And so I ended up back at the headquarters where I started and where I'm currently based again. And this was 5 years ago. And we talked with our executive team who said, we've got so many different efforts across the company. Google is a company that, started in a garage only 20 years ago, at the time 15 years ago. We care so much about this, and we have all these organic efforts, but we don't really have an organized, cohesive initiative. So we're not really sure if this is a full-time job. Do you want to experiment? Come figure out with us what we're already doing, and B, proactively, what opportunity do we have to really impact entrepreneurs all around the world? And so that was our experiment, which has currently become Google for Entrepreneurs.
That's awesome. So along the way, along your journey and travels and sort of the creation of Google for Entrepreneurs, was there any one or a number of folks that you were leaning on as mentors or people that were kind of guiding you through that process?
So many people, both within industry and really all over the world. So at Google itself, I've been really fortunate to have amazing mentors, both directly and indirectly. Megan Smith, who I mentioned, is phenomenal. David Drummond, who's one of our senior vice presidents, actually hired me 12 years ago. I really admire his global perspective on the world and how deeply he promotes a free and open internet. So he's one of my role models and mentors. But really, it's been the entrepreneurs that I've been lucky to meet on the road and just see. At Google, we talk a lot about this concept that constraint breeds creativity. So the lack of resources actually pushes you to be much more innovative and scrappier than you might imagine. And if you think about these environments where there's limited bandwidth, limited electricity, where it's unsafe, literally, physically at times, how entrepreneurs are bringing hustle and grit and really innovating because it's an imperative. And so leaning on those folks and actually checking in, there's a wonderful entrepreneur in Afghanistan named Roya Mahbub, and I met her when I was there in 2011, and she started this software company called Citadel IT. They're the largest software company in Afghanistan. What's remarkable is they employ 50% male-female ratio,
Whoa,
which is
yeah,
really
extraordinary.
unique for the region. But I've been sort of following her journey. We check in with each other, and she was honored a couple years ago by Time Magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. So it's really great to see, these types of stories that can inspire all of us, but definitely have inspired me.
So what is, I mean, if you could, for, people here, like, is everybody familiar with Google for Entrepreneurs, honestly, before you came here tonight? Raise your hand. So, I mean, that's surprising to me, I guess.
I'm glad you came.
Yes, yeah. So for all of those folks, and I guess for everyone, tell us, what is the mission? What's the vision? And I know it's been 5 years and perhaps it's evolved a bit, but really, what's the overarching mission?
Sure. The overall sort of driving force for us is, we are a company with entrepreneurial roots. We were founded by entrepreneurs in a garage. We were built by entrepreneurial people, and we're passionate about being a technology platform for the next generation to be successful. And so our mission is really to bring the best of Google's resources into startup communities all around the world and help accelerate their success. And a couple things in that. One, what I love about the work we get to do is it's not philanthropic in the sense that it's part of Google's core business. We believe that we don't charge a cent for any of our programs, any of the work that we do. We don't take equity in any of our partner organizations or directly in startups. But we're not doing it purely for, out of goodwill. We really believe that investing in communities ultimately will lead to more job creation and lead to more companies coming online, leveraging the internet. It's a win-win situation where hopefully all boats will rise. And so at the heart of Google for Entrepreneurs, there's two different areas of the business, I would say. One is how do we scale and really help communities all around the world? There's no region or country that we don't care about. And so that we achieve through partnerships. So we today partner with about 50 organizations who I believe are the best in the world at supporting entrepreneurs throughout the life cycle. So groups like Startup Grind, who we're proudly global partners with, really helping at the inspirational, aspirational stage of bringing and building community. Groups like Techstars, Startup Weekend, who are helping at the stage of, I have a product or I have an idea, I need acceleration. Groups like Astia Global, who are helping companies at a little later stage get access to capital. Their mission is to create connections between female founders and venture capital. So thinking about how do we address it from a partnership perspective, we've got 50 partners who together reach over 140 countries in their footprint. And that's been a really robust, amazing community. And the second part is the work that we directly as Google for Entrepreneurs do ourselves. And so we run a series of campuses. We have 6 campuses for startups. These are on average 20,000 square feet collaborative spaces. We have them in London, Tel Aviv, Seoul, Madrid, Warsaw, and heading
Chicago?
to, we have a partner. We have a wonderful partner, 1871 here in Chicago.
Of course.
Yes. But Sao Paulo is our 6th campus, launching in 2 weeks, actually. So the second part of it is really how do we create some of these physical spaces ourselves, but more importantly, layer programs and education, a lot of outreach to underrepresented communities within tech to try to bring them in. So I'm really proud of the work that the entire network is doing. We're trying to essentially help foster a global community, and I don't say build because these communities, as evidenced by tonight, are already thriving. It's sort of how do we help bring Google's resources. So that includes money in some cases. I should clarify, we don't directly fund startups. Google Ventures is the venture arm of Google that would fund startups. But we can support organizations financially. Second thing is we're a tech company. So where we have products that could be useful, we, for example, have a distribution of credits on the Google Cloud platform where startups can get access to up to $100,000 for free on Google Cloud through our network. So figuring out what types of unique value can we provide.
So at least a couple of times tonight already you've mentioned particularly the story in Afghanistan, which is interesting, the ratio of men to women, which is, I'm sure, way higher than it actually is in the United States. And but let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about diversity and why that's important to Google for Entrepreneurs, maybe why it's important to you personally, and why.
Sure. I think I'm really excited about all the conversations that are happening globally, but particularly in the mainstream tech press over the past couple years about this issue of diversity in tech, or lack thereof, I should say. Mm-hmm. And I think it's driving a lot of not just conversation, but action. So from a Google perspective, we're certainly deeply committed as a company. We understand that we ourselves as an employer have a lot of work to do. We humbly were the first to actually release our own diversity data in the industry, and many other companies have since done so. I think acknowledging first what is the reality that we're facing and how do we work together to improve it. But secondly, from a community perspective, I'm very excited. We've seen, so our strategy to build a more inclusive entrepreneur community is threefold. One is we look for partner organizations who specifically are tackling issues, trying to reach out to groups who are underrepresented. And so we have about 7 or 8 partners, including ASTIA, who I mentioned, Manos Accelerator, an accelerator for Latino-led founders, New Me Accelerator, the Platform Summit, a number of folks doing really great work. The second is through programs that we run, so kind of experimenting with our own. One of my favorite programs in that bucket is called Campus for Moms, and that's something that we run in the campuses that I mentioned. And so we know that the traditional accelerator, on average, is about 3 months. It's super immersive. It can be 24/7, not conducive for new parents at all. So we're running this pilot called Campus for Moms, which is a 10-week baby-friendly startup school where we condense the curricula into 1 day per week. You bring your babies with you. We have crying rooms and playrooms and feeding rooms. And these women build companies together, and they're extraordinary. I've been to several of the demo days. We now run it in all 7 countries in which we have campuses. And so it's pretty unique to think about all that needed to happen there was a change in the model itself. So that's part 2. And then part 3 is how do we have this really robust community that I mentioned of these 50 partner organizations. How can we layer programs across them? So we just in November did our first global Google for Entrepreneurs Women's Demo Day in Silicon Valley, where we said we'll put it together, we'll host it, we'll pack the room with investors from Silicon Valley, and then we'll have an open call for our partners and the general public to nominate female-led startups who are raising a Series A. We had over 450 companies apply from 40 countries, and they were fantastic. So those types of initiatives were really, we can drive awareness, but I should say that diversity to us doesn't, of course, just mean diversity in gender. It's what does it mean uniquely in that community? So we've got a number of initiatives that we're working on, but it's definitely one of our top priorities.
That's awesome. I just saw something today. I think Howard Tolman shared it, that Chicago is the friendliest or best city for female founders in the United States.
Interesting. I was reading, Wall Street Journal published an article this week talking about, of the 204 deals done in Silicon Valley last year, so companies who received investment, only 8% of them are female-led, and that represents a decline of 30% from the previous year. So it was a rude awakening to hear that we're actually trending not in the right direction, but having visibility, and I think there's actually a lack of great data around the issue, so being the more data, the more empowered.
I was actually going to ask you that. I mean, are you guys gathering data, not just in the US, but around the world, and trying to measure, literally measure the impact that you're having?
Certainly. So we certainly do measure and try to track closely the entrepreneurs, with whom we have direct contact or a direct way of reaching. So within the campuses that I mentioned, we have 70,000 members globally. Within our partner community, we know that they are reaching about 100,000 entrepreneurs a year, but that's not still the right sample size relative to the world. So we recently convened a roundtable in Silicon Valley with a lot of key players to figure out how do we address this issue of lack of data, who's doing what, and hopefully we'll have more to come this year.
Very, very cool. So let's put on our entrepreneur's cap, if you will, and I'm sure everybody here is sort of dying to think about, or at least hear from you. What do you think are, let's use the Google crystal ball for a moment. So what do you think, where are we headed in the next 5 to 10 years? What are the kinds of things that that you're seeing that are emerging that maybe strikes a chord with some folks here?
Well, one, I think, first and foremost, the way that the internet has democratized access to not just information, but to entrepreneurship has been so exciting. Even since I started in this particular role, just in the last half decade, witnessing the capability that people have, how the web can help your business succeed. It sounds like a Google ad, but it's not, right? It's an ad for the open internet and communication, and the ability for one person to launch an app or a startup or a company in Brazil and have users instantly in Asia. So thinking about, I would say, internationalizing, launching globally from day one, the greatest determinant of success that I see is a company launching in Paris, for example, just for the French market, which is 80 million people, that's substantial, or are they launching out the get-go to go global? And so I think our unique value prop with Google for Entrepreneurs is we are a global company and a global platform, so we endeavor to help startups go global from day one. So that's one thing. Secondly, I'm really excited about all the advancements that are happening around machine learning, artificial intelligence right now. This computing power that we have access to now is unprecedented. And just to give one example from the past year would be Google Photos. Anybody in here use Google Photos? So what's interesting is that we had previous photo technology at Google, but machine learning has enabled us now to have the beautiful, useful search functionality that you see. I can search for photos of my dog, or Chicago in the rain, or sunsets on the beach, or a specific person, and it's instant, the way search is. So I think that's a really exciting trend that we're seeing. I think mobile, everyone is very excited about mobile, but the opportunities are still limitless, and still, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Also thinking about opportunities in the emerging markets and the next wave of the next billion, the next 2-3 billion people who are coming online, who we all as entrepreneurs have access to as customers. Now it's truly a global opportunity.
I was just thinking, and I don't know how many folks have been to Silicon Valley and have seen, your autonomous driving vehicle out there. It's a little bit weird, but what are your thoughts around that? And I had this discussion with a colleague of mine here tonight that sort of see like the vehicle as sort of this big net of data gathering, data points, literally around the globe. How do you see that, the car, I guess, fitting into Google's, future?
Well, I think as an overall just consumer, as a user, as a driver, as a person who lives in the Bay Area with some of the currently the most unfortunate traffic in the country, it feels, the commute that used to be 40 minutes when I first moved there is now almost 2 hours one way. And so thinking about that as just a commuter, right? The ability to get from A to B, or how services like Uber and Lyft have really disrupted, to your point, the way we think about it. Do we need to own a car? I think that there's a lot technology can do. I'm super excited about it. I think that it's a long-term game, but the idea of intelligent devices, whether that's a connected home, a television, the Nest thermostat that saves electricity when I'm on the road all the time, these are things that I'm incredibly excited about, sort of bringing intelligence into previously inanimate objects.
What's ahead for Google for Entrepreneurs? 5 years from now, and I don't mean to be cliche, but what does Google for Entrepreneurs look like?
It's a great question, because long-term at Google has always been about 6 months. But now that we're dealing more with physical spaces and longer-term investments and long-term partnerships like the one we have with Startup Grind and others, it's exciting to start thinking longer-term about the future. So for us, it's about the current frame of mind is building this infrastructure around the world of great organizations, but also literal infrastructure. So we have, for example, the 6 campuses I mentioned. We have 25 physical space partners who are running collaborative spaces like 1871 in Chicago. And so we have now launched the Google for Entrepreneurs Global Passport. So if you're a member of any of those partner spaces or any campus, you can work for free from any other city in the world when you're on the road. Again, trying to help you go global, but thinking about building 1.0 is sort of this physical infrastructure. I think 2.0, I'm excited thinking about education. There are so many groups doing amazing work in this space, but what's the future of education there and content around entrepreneurship? There's so much. How do we help synthesize, help bring offline experiences, think about that. The third thing is definitely a continued focus on diversity. I mean, we're moving the needle a little bit in the right direction. One of the initiatives that we ran 2 years ago was called 40 Forward, and that was a call to action across 40, our then 40 partner communities, to say if you have an idea for how to launch a new program or tweak an existing program, let's try to increase representation among women across the world in our communities by 25% this year. We're going to allocate $1 million toward this goal, and so please apply for a portion of these funds. So in that 1 year period, we saw a net 10% increase of participation of women. So more initiatives like that where we can just leverage the collective power of what we now have together.
That's extraordinary. We actually participated,
Yes.
and we had Jen Tiers, you probably know, founder of Sitter City, and we'll do it again this year in May. We'll
So
have a
Derek
female founder.
Anderson told me that the year that Startup Grind did that, so May was Women Take the Stage month, where they encouraged as many chapters as possible to have prominent women in their communities as speakers. So that was the single month in Startup Grind history with the highest number of events, with the highest number of attendees ever. So it sort of showed me that just tiny concerted push of the community leaders going out there had a huge impact.
Absolutely. I mean, I saw it firsthand. You mentioned something that struck me, and I've got two little ones, 8 and an 11-year-old, and they both get a Chromebook when they go to school. And
Is that from you or the school?
the school,
Nice.
yeah. So tell us about what you guys are doing in education, and so diversity and such. But let's even move back into sort of the lives of our next great founders, and what kinds of initiatives are you doing in education?
Google as a whole has a number of efforts in the K through 12 space. I think the Chromebook partnership with the Chicago public school system is a great example of trying to introduce technology early or in ways that can be useful. But on the entrepreneur side specifically, we've got a few exciting partnerships. One of my favorites is called, am I allowed to say I have favorites? It's called Lemonade Day, and they're a nonprofit based in Texas. And essentially they teach kids entrepreneurship through the concept of lemonade stands. And so they're active now in 36 cities across the US. They've reached over 100,000 kids a year. But they basically get adults like yourselves who have experience in various aspects of the business industry to sign on board and teach kids in a 14-week course, culminating in National Lemonade Day, when everyone runs their stands. And half of the money goes back to charities in the community. But the idea is, we all know the concept of lemonade stand, but how do you market it? What's the price point? What are the ingredients? It's really cool to see. So I think these types of initiatives at an early age are really powerful.
That's very cool. So I know you do something on, you have a nonprofit, I believe. So tell us about that and what's your mission?
Sure. So my husband, Steve, we were both from the Midwest originally. We were both born in Iowa. He grew up in Minnesota. And so we've been out in the Valley for some time now, both working in tech. And so we had this desire to do something together outside of sort of the everyday work that we're lucky to get to do. But we want to think about how do we connect, where we're from with where we get to live today. And so we started this nonprofit 2 years ago called Silicon North Stars. And our mission is to provide access to underserved youth from Minnesota to Silicon Valley. And so we choose kids from Minneapolis and St. Paul who are at that summer right before they enter high school. And we bring them out to Silicon Valley for a 1-week immersive tech boot camp. They get an inside scoop at companies like Facebook and Google and YouTube, go to Stanford, meet startups, go through design thinking, and actually build a prototype for a startup, which we put together a real live demo day for them at the end. And the idea is that's the 1 week, the inspiration part of it. And then you come back to Minnesota, start high school, and then become part of an alumni community there that meets regularly every quarter and gets connected to the local tech community. So I'm a huge proponent that you don't need to move to Silicon Valley to be successful. You don't need to, that's not the only place where tech is thriving. But to the extent we can offer those connections, offer access, and we intentionally select youth from, really economically underserved communities. And when we work on the Silicon Valley curriculum, we really try to bring diverse team members of the companies where we visit. And it's actually, it's a hard thing to achieve. But one of my proudest moments was at the end of this summer's cohort, many of the kids remarked to me, wow, Silicon Valley is a place where I could see myself because I see people like me. And for those of us who live and work there, we know that's unfortunately not reflective of what we want, but I want them to feel that it will be that way by the time they're there.
That's very, very cool. So how many people here are founders or part of a startup? Raise your hand. So probably 50%. So I don't know if this is going to be a painful or tricky question, but you've seen a lot of startups, I'm sure. You've seen a lot of very successful startups and probably a good number that haven't succeeded. If you were to, putting aside the technology and business model and all of that, if you were to pinpoint maybe 1, 2, or 3 things that a common thread that you see across the successful startups, and then perhaps a common thread that you see across the not so successful startups.
Sure, I think looking at it from across the globe too, a really common trend I've seen is for those founders who are open from the get-go, are getting feedback early and often from users, from potential investors, from other entrepreneurs, from friends, we tend to all, wear it very open and then sort of just always getting feedback, always getting advice early and often. And I've seen in many markets, particularly some outside the US, entrepreneurs who will be heads down and for whatever reason refuse to get feedback 2-3 years in. And someone could have told you in the first 3 months that there's no addressable market or that's a feature, not a product, right? And so I think this openness, this willingness to be collaborative and not fearful that somebody's going to steal my idea or I'm going to be criticized and take it personally, the sort of getting honest feedback often has been, I think, one of the core attributes that I've seen.
Very cool. And then the not so successful? Not doing that, I guess.
I mean, I think,
easy answer.
but I do think from a market perspective, thinking at it from a hyper-local way. I mean, if you look at markets like Estonia or Israel, right, where the populations are very small, they're forced to go global from day one, and they have a disproportionate percentage of success.
Yeah.
So I would say focusing on a very insular market. Of course, one must start somewhere, but from the get-go, having a plan for how to go global, how to internationalize.
Very cool. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and open it up for questions in the crowd. I'm sure there's a million or two.
I think specifically, this is our 3rd year, so it's like a startup, if you will, and it's been really fun and fulfilling for me personally to be on the other side. We're in the process of trying to raise money ourselves now, but we definitely bootstrapped it the first year. 2nd year had bootstrapping plus friends and family, and this year I'm out there pitching to foundations, and I've actually used the templates for startup decks that I work on with startups, right? But it's totally different context. That's been really fun, fulfilling. To me, I think it's the reason we targeted the summer before 9th grade was we felt like that was a critical time when you're developing so much of a sense of self. And so many high schools now, we partner in St. Paul with Humboldt High School and the Washington Technology Magnet School. So many schools are baking into the curricula technology components and just tech literacy in general, which I think is really exciting and really amazing. But for us, it's more about the aspirational potential of I'm not going to rule that out as a possibility for myself.
Yeah, right here.
It's a really good question. I think you have to we really advise and try to be as data-driven as possible, whatever that data set may be. So if you have a consumer-facing product, getting that data or doing A/B testing or having, let the data drive the decision. But I think you tend to know if it's not going to work and you need to pivot, but sometimes cutting it off can be so painful for whatever reason, whether that's staff or layoff or really serious implications and you don't want to get it wrong. But I would say sooner is better than later if the data drives you to believe that. So our strategy for the US has been to really focus on markets outside of Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York, not because we don't care about those markets, but there's, in general, quite a density, and we're really excited about this next wave of cities, entrepreneurial cities like Chicago and Nashville and Durham, Detroit, Minneapolis, that next wave. And so our strategy for the US has been to partner because we're seeing so many amazing collaborative spaces come up. So we have 11 partners in North America, in the US and Canada, and they form what we call the North American Tech Hub Network. And so it's 11 cities, each has a partner hub, and we actually do operate as a network. So we get together quarterly with the executive leadership. We're always thinking about programs we can roll across. So for example, 1871 Chicago's got such a strong foothold in travel as a vertical. So they recently hosted a vertical travel day for startups from across that North American Tech Hub network, came here, made great connections with potential investors, clients, et cetera. It was super valuable. So thinking about that. So I would say our general strategy is if someone's doing it super, super well, we'd rather support the local player.
So I've got a question. Just, I mean, your job, it seems to me, takes a Herculean effort, and so I'm curious. Like, what does your team look like? Who supports you?
It's more like I support them. They're an amazing group of people. They're the ones on the front lines who really are making it happen every day. But we're scrappy, like the rest of Google. It's always been surprising to me. Google is and seems like such a large company, but behind all these efforts, you'll find, hey, there's 5 engineers who work on X project or Y project. So our team is about 30 people now worldwide. We sit in 7 countries. So all of the countries I mentioned where we have a campus, we have a really scrappy team running a 20,000 square foot space for the community. And in the US, we have 10 people. And in general, we've got folks who focus on partnerships, folks who focus on marketing to make sure that entrepreneurs know about the programs that we have to offer, people focused on diversity-specific programs, and then the education piece is new. And I'm super excited for the first time about Google bringing curriculum directly to communities, both
Awesome.
Technical and non-technical.
Very cool.
Yes, we have an enormous initiative around that, around women and girls, STEM education, also a whole team called Women Tech Makers, specifically focused on the more technical aspect. So we collaborate very closely with these teams. I would say, Google for Entrepreneurs is more focused on startups and generally current adult entrepreneurs, so to speak. We've got a whole team really focused on that. K through 12, STEM, definitely. The best central gallery to find out about them is google.com/entrepreneurs. And there we try to list all the partners, all the communities. So there's 2 ways to get involved. One is, if you're in a city where we have a partner, like here in Chicago, that partner acts as our central hub for resources that we can push out. So for example, the cloud credit offering that I mentioned is something that anyone can get access to. In Chicago, that would be through 1871. Or we have amazing partners like Startup Grind, who with our help have expanded from about 20-something cities to 200, as you mentioned. So that's one. 2 is if you're interested, if you're an organization who you think could be a potential partner, our model is it's almost very B2B, meaning Google to community organizer. We believe that we're going to achieve more scale through that. So in that case, please come talk to me.
So before we go, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us here today. And
it was my pleasure. Thank you.
And a very, I think, very heartfelt way that Startup Grind, of course, is very grateful for Google for Entrepreneurs. But I think more than anything, all the initiatives that you have around diversity and such, and not in the usual places like Silicon Valley, I think is admirable and wonderful. So, all right, everybody, let's give it up for Mary Grove.
Thank you so much.
Once
Thanks
again.
for letting me be a part of it.